Picture this, a hot June morning in 1839 on a muddy beach at Human near Canton. Thousands of people crowd the shoreline, jostling for a glimpse. Soldiers form a cordon. In the center, laborers heave heavy wooden chests into 3 huge pits carved into the sand. The chests are smashed open. Sticky brown opium cakes spill out, hacked into chunks and dumped into seawater. Lime is poured in. The mixture boils and hisses, throwing up a sickly, sweet, acrid steam. For 23 days this continues. Over 20,000 chests, more than 1 million kilograms, dissolved into a toxic soup and washed out to sea. Overseeing it is a stern official in silk robes, Commissioner Lin Zexu. To some, he is a fanatic. To others, Lin as clear as the heavens, a righteous scholar trying to save China from addiction. On that beach, he believes he is extinguishing a national curse. Across the sea, powerful men see something different. They don't see poison being destroyed. They see property seized, contracts broken, an entire financial system built on that opium attacked by a foreign government. And they command a weapon Lin cannot imagine, an industrial empire armed with iron ships and hungry balance sheets. Within months, steam gunboats will batter ancient forts. Cities will be forced open. What begins as a moral crusade at Human becomes a spark for the Opium Wars, conflicts that turn Britain into a narco empire and push China into a century of humiliation. Why does any of this matter now? Because beneath the old uniforms and wooden junks lies a pattern we still recognize. A rich society addicted to a product, a government desperate to fix its books, corporations turning human vulnerability into revenue, and a distant population paying the price. In early 19th century Britain, tea is more than a drink. It's fuel. Factory workers drink it instead of foul water. Families build daily rituals around it. The government taxes it heavily. Between 1814 and 1837, tea duties pour tens of millions of pounds into the treasury. There's a catch. China, under the Qing dynasty, is the only reliable source of that tea. And China has almost no interest in British goods. Emperor Qianlong has already told King George III, "We possess all things and have no use for your country's manufactures." Chinese merchants want one thing, silver. So the silver flows one way. Ship after ship sails from London to Canton loaded with bullion. In return come tea, silk and porcelain, and a devastating trade deficit. By the 1820s, so much silver is leaving Britain to pay for Chinese goods that officials fear for the stability of the financial system. The East India Company, which manages the China trade, is bleeding metal. They face a brutal choice. Either give up Britain's tea addiction or find something the Chinese will buy in staggering quantities. They choose the latter. The product must be scarce, desirable, and addictive. It must come from territory Britain controls. And it must be something Chinese officials don't want, but can't stop. That product is opium. Follow the story east again, this time to the Ganges Plain in northern India. On the riverbank sits the Patna Opium Factory, a sprawling brick complex that looks more like an arsenal than a farm. Inside a vast hall, thousands of dark, sticky balls sit on wooden racks, stretching into the distance. Workers move in silence, turning each ball so it dries evenly. The air is heavy with the sweet, nauseating scent of raw opium. Behind this scene is a vast coercive system. British opium agencies don't grow poppies themselves. They lock over 1 million Indian peasant households into contracts. Agents offer small cash advances to poor farmers, money they desperately need. The price? Plant poppies on your best land and sell the sap back to the company at a fixed low price. Once you take the advance, you can't refuse. Decline to grow enough poppy, and agents threaten your fields, your freedom, sometimes your life. Local records describe kidnappings, arrests, and threats of crop destruction for those who resist. The prices barely cover costs, but by century's end, around 10 million people in provinces like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh depend on this toxic crop. The pattern isn't new. Back in 1769-1770, in Bengal, British rulers had already pushed farmers from food crops toward exports like indigo and opium. When drought struck, there wasn't enough rice. As famine spread, company officials kept exporting grain and refused to cut taxes. Around 10 million people died, roughly a third of Bengal's population, while company profits actually rose. That cold arithmetic now powers the opium machine. Processed opium from Patna and Ghazipur is pressed into standardized cakes, packed into wooden chests stamped with the East India Company seal, and sent downriver to Calcutta. There the company holds auctions. Private firms, Jardine Matheson, Dent & Co., and others bid eagerly, load their purchases onto fast ships, and head for China. This is the triangular trade that keeps the British Empire solvent. British manufactures and capital flow to India. In India, they pay for administration and buy opium. That opium sails to China, where it's traded illegally for silver on offshore hulks and small coastal depots. The silver is then used by company agents in Canton to purchase tea, which sails back to Britain. Opium funds the tea. Tea taxes fund the British state. Indian peasants and Chinese users bear the cost. In China, the impact creeps in quietly, then explodes. At first, opium is a luxury vice of the elite. Pipes appear in scholars' studios, merchants' parlors, even some officials' chambers. But as imports climb, from a few thousand chests a year to tens of thousands, the smoke spreads. Coastal villages see fishermen pawning their nets. Craftsmen skip work to chase a high. Even soldiers in frontier garrisons slip into dependence, their discipline rotting. By the late 1830s, millions of Chinese are addicted. Exact numbers vary, but everyone agrees the scale is shocking. Opium dens multiply. Families sell heirlooms and land to feed habits. The economic damage runs deeper than ruined lives. In the Qing tax system, levies are calculated in silver, while most daily transactions use copper coins. As silver pours out of China to pay foreign merchants for opium, it becomes scarce. Its value relative to copper doubles in some regions. That means peasants need far more copper cash to buy the silver they owe in taxes, even though official rates don't change. A hidden tax hike rolls across the countryside. Imagine a small landholder in inland China. You've never smoked opium. You've never seen a foreigner. Yet each year it takes more and more copper coins to buy the silver demanded by tax collectors. You sell tools, then livestock, then part of your field. Resentment of the distant Qing court grows with every coin. By 1838, the Daoguang emperor can't ignore the crisis. Reports pile up. Troops addicted, silver reserves drained, social order fraying. Officials argue in the Forbidden City. Some urge legalization and taxation of opium to reclaim revenue. Others say a moral empire cannot live off poison. Into this debate steps Lin Zexu. Lin is famous for integrity and hard work. When the emperor names him imperial commissioner and sends him south to Canton, he gives Lin extraordinary powers and a simple mission: stop the opium. Lin moves fast. He cracks down on Chinese dealers, orders pipes and paraphernalia surrendered, and demands that foreign merchants hand over all opium in their possession and swear never to traffic it again, under penalty of death. When they hedge, he targets their vulnerability, dependence on Chinese labor. Overnight, servants, cooks, and porters are ordered to quit the foreign factories. British traders, used to privilege, suddenly haul their own water and cook their own food inside a shrinking cage. Soldiers ring the compound. Boats block the river. Supplies are cut. Drums and gongs sound through the night. It is a siege without bullets, designed to force a single outcome: surrender. During this standoff, Lin writes a long letter addressed to Queen Victoria. Whether it ever reaches her is unclear, but its logic is simple. Britain bans opium at home, he notes, proving it knows the drug's dangers. So how can it justify selling that same poison abroad? If Britain values Chinese tea and silk, why repay those benefits by flooding China with something that destroys families? 3. Inside the besieged factories, tension climbs. The merchants, led by men like Lancelot Dent, argue and stall. Then Charles Elliot, the British superintendent of trade, forces his way into the compound to take control. Elliot sees two things clearly. First, Lin will not back down. Second, if the merchants keep resisting, violence will likely erupt. So he takes a drastic step. On behalf of the Crown, Elliot orders all British opium surrendered to his custody, promising government compensation. In that act, over 20,000 chests of contraband become British state property. When Lin destroys them at Human, he is no longer just enforcing Chinese law against smugglers. In British eyes, he has obliterated assets owned, on paper, by the British nation. That legal shift is what turns a moral crackdown into a casus belli. Back in London, one man in particular is ready to exploit the outrage. William Jardine, the retired co-founder of Jardine Matheson, has built a fortune shipping opium from India to China. Now he hears that his stock has been poured into the sea. He also understands the bigger stakes. If China can simply crush the opium trade, the entire triangular system propping up British India is at risk. Jardine heads straight for the center of power. He meets with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, armed with maps and data. He frames the human destruction not as a sovereign government enforcing its own laws, but as an insult to the British flag and an attack on property and free trade. If China can seize and destroy British goods at will, he argues, all commerce, including the precious tea trade, is unsafe. Parliament takes up the issue in a fierce debate. Palmerston argues that Britain must respond. A great power, he says, cannot allow its subjects to be imprisoned, threatened with death, and stripped of property without trial. He casts the proposed expedition as a defense of international law and commercial rights, barely mentioning opium itself. Across the aisle, a young William Gladstone is appalled. He calls the trade infamous and the looming conflict a war more unjust in its origin than any he has read of. He insists that China has every right to ban poison and that Britain is about to fight not for honor, but for drug profits. When the government faces a vote of censure over the crisis, it survives by just 9 votes. That narrow margin reveals the unease in Britain, but also the decision. Economic imperatives trump moral qualms. And Britain has a new tool ready to enforce that decision. In 1839, at a shipyard in Birkenhead, engineers build a strange new vessel for the East India Company, the steamship Nemesis. She isn't the biggest ship afloat, but she's unlike anything in Chinese waters. Her hull is iron, not wood, making her far less vulnerable to traditional cannon fire. Paddle wheels driven by steam engines push her upriver against current and wind. Most importantly, she draws only about 5 to 6 feet of water. That shallow draft lets her slip into estuaries and rivers that sailing frigates can't safely enter. To Chinese sailors used to towering junks and the rhythm of the monsoon, she seems unnatural, a ship that doesn't care about wind or tide, armored against their guns. They call her the Devil Ship. At the Second Battle of Chuenpi in January 1841, Nemesis shows exactly why. A fleet of Chinese war junks sails out to defend the forts guarding the mouth of the Pearl River. They are large, brightly painted, manned by hundreds, but they rely on sails and human muscle. Nemesis steams into the shallows just out of range of most Chinese guns and begins to rake the enemy with her own. At one point, she launches a Congreve rocket, a crude predecessor of the modern missile. The rocket arcs wildly, then plunges into a large junk. A moment later, the ship detonates in a massive explosion, showering the bay with splinters, bodies, and burning debris. Every man on board is killed instantly. For Chinese observers, it's like watching a volcano erupt in the middle of the fleet. Panic follows. Ship after ship is sunk, burned, or captured. British casualties are minimal. This is the pattern of the war. Iron and steam versus wood and wind. Heavy modern guns against masonry forts built for earlier ages. British forces seize key coastal positions, then push up rivers once considered safe behind shallow bars and narrow channels. By 1842, British ships are sailing up the Yangtze, threatening Nanjing, and more importantly, the Grand Canal, the artery that moves grain to the northern capital region. If that supply line is cut, the Qing dynasty faces famine and rebellion in its political heartland. With few good options left, the emperor sues for peace. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842, is short on paper, but huge in impact. China agrees to pay a large indemnity in silver, covering the destroyed opium, merchants' debts, and the costs of the war. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, are open to British residents and trade. Foreigners gain the right to live in these treaty ports, rent property, and trade with fewer intermediaries. Most famously, China cedes the small island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. For merchants like Jardine, Hong Kong is a dream, a deep-water harbor outside Chinese law, perfectly placed at the mouth of the Pearl River. Within a few years, Jardine Matheson and other firms shift their headquarters there, using it as a base to dominate the China trade. The treaty doesn't explicitly legalize opium, but British power and the new treaty port system make serious enforcement impossible. The flood of the drug continues and eventually grows. China has lost more than a war. It has lost control over its own economic front door. For Lin Zexu, the consequences are personal. He is dismissed, blamed at court for provoking disaster, and sent into internal exile. He will never hold such sweeping power again. Yet his story does not end as simple failure. In later Chinese memory, Lin becomes a symbol of resistance, a man who tried to put morality above profit and sovereignty above foreign pressure. The site of the human destruction becomes a monument. June 3rd, the day the opium was first destroyed, is marked as Anti-Drug Day. The economic and human damage unleashed by the Opium Wars lasts long past 1842. Opium consumption continues to rise, entangled with politics and commerce. By the early 20th century, tens of millions of Chinese use the drug in some form. In provinces like Yunnan, both production and addiction reach staggering levels. Efforts at reform by Qing officials, then Republican governments, face entrenched local interests and foreign pressure. Only after the communist victory in 1949 does the system crack. The new regime launches a fierce anti-drug campaign. Opium dens are shut down. Dealers face harsh punishment, sometimes execution. Addicts are forced into compulsory treatment. By applying enormous state power, sometimes brutally, the epidemic that began as a line item in Britain's trade accounts is largely wiped out within a few years. The cost of ending it is high, but the memory of how it began is higher still. So what does this long, tangled story tell us now? It shows how cold numbers, trade deficits, revenue streams, bullion flows can drive hot wars. The Opium Wars were not fought for religion or culture or even territory alone. They were fought to defend a financial loop. Indian peasants growing poppy, British firms shipping opium, Chinese consumers paying in silver, British officials using that silver to buy tea and pay debts. It also shows that addiction is not just an individual weakness. It can be engineered into economies. In 19th century Asia, opium wasn't simply a vice. It was a pillar of government revenue, a tool of foreign policy, a weapon in a balance of payments crisis. The pattern recurs. Today, the commodities and substances may change. Oil, rare earths, data, synthetic opioids, consumer debt. But the logic often looks familiar. Powerful states and corporations seek products with inelastic demand. They entangle distant populations in supply chains they don't control. And when those chains are threatened, lofty language about freedom and security often masks very concrete financial fears. That's why one question from the Opium Wars still cuts through the smoke. Whose balance sheet matters more than whose body? In the 1830s, Britain answered that question with steamships and shells. The solvency of an empire, the flow of tea, and the comfort of a home ritual in London weighed more in practice than the lives of Indian peasants or Chinese addicts. On a beach at Human, Lin Zexu tried to answer differently. Surrounded by soldiers and sweating laborers, he poured a mountain of opium into the sea and wrote to a foreign queen, appealing to shared morality. He lost that battle. Iron hulls and hungry ledgers crushed his stand. But the questions he raised about profit, power, and responsibility didn't disappear. They echo each time a powerful country defends a harmful trade as free, each time a government chooses revenue over public health, each time a distant population suffers for someone else's addiction. We live in a world still shaped by choices made in that era, by the logic of the narco empire and the wars fought to protect it. Remembering how it began, on a crowded beach with boiling pits and a stubborn official, helps us see our own age more clearly. It asks us quietly but insistently what we are willing to fight for, and what and whom we are still willing to sacrifice for the numbers in our ledgers.